Welcome back. We're discussing settlements and the prospects for peace as Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas prepares for his first meeting with US President Barack Obama. I'm now joined by Dr. Mark Levine from the University of California at Irvine. He is the author of An Impossible Peace, Israel-Palestine since 1989. Welcome to the show. Now, before the break,
so much for having me.
Before the break, we asked what's the best way for the US to help bring an end to Israeli settlement expansion. 30% of you thought diplomacy was the best route, 58% thought a cut in US aid to Israel, and 12% felt the US should cooperate with Israeli goals on Iran policy. Of course, we should remind you that these results are unscientific. Well, let's go to Dr. Levine in California. We heard there the comments of Dr. Shibley Telhami here in the studio, in which he said that the administration here has been pretty firm with the Israelis and made the point that they've been firm for the first time in a long time. Do you agree with that?
Well, I don't know how we would define firm. I mean, let me quote a headline from The Economist way back in 1992, where they said to Israel, it's basically our money or your settlements. And it's that kind of stark choice, which I think is the only thing that's going to convince the majority of Israelis to stop the settlements. Because the average Israeli today spends only about 30 cents a day to keep the entire settlement infrastructure going. That's $500 million a year out of a $200 billion GDP. To uproot the entire settlement infrastructure, which is what would be necessary to create a Palestinian state, or at least the vast majority of settlements, would be so costly internally, militarily, economically, that most Israelis realize it's not worth doing, and keeping the occupation going is actually cheaper and less painful. Unless the US is willing to put enough pressure on Israel to change that calculus, I don't see how this is going to change the dynamics on the ground, and a two-state solution is going to be all but impossible to achieve.
What about the statement that Secretary Clinton made? She was very clear. She said President Obama wants to see a stop to settlements, not some settlements, not outposts, not natural growth exceptions. That was pretty clear, and I thought pretty firm as well.
Well, you know, this is actually really interesting, because stopping settlements at this point, even if Netanyahu ultimately agrees to this maybe a year from now, is not going to do anything, because it's too late. The settlements that are already in place make the creation of a territorially viable Palestinian state impossible to achieve. The only way to create a territorially viable Palestinian state is to actually roll back the vast majority of settlements, which, as Professor Telhami pointed out, used to be considered illegal by the United States, and certainly under almost every conception of international law are illegal. So by saying stop the settlements, it sounds good, but in reality it's meaningless if you really want to create a Palestinian state. And the same thing goes with this idea of Netanyahu not accepting a Palestinian state. The fact that the US is not jumping on this is actually shocking, because Ariel Sharon, the godfather of the settlement movement, accepted a Palestinian state 5 or 6 years ago already. And the fact that Netanyahu is moving the goalposts back again, and the US is allowing him to do this so that when he finally accepts a Palestinian state, he can try to extract an impossible concession from Palestinians, is also creating a situation where a two-state solution is going to be impossible.
Okay, I want to go to the phones again. We have a caller from the United Kingdom. Samir, go ahead.
I would like to ask him, please, now Mr. Abbas is in the US. What is the relevance of Mr. Abbas and his authority, you know, given the changes on the ground to territories, to governments, and the guys are backing him from Fatah, you know, they are distancing himself from him now. Okay. What is his relevance to the peace process?
All right, thank you. Thank you for your question.
Unfortunately, I think Abbas is increasingly irrelevant. I mean, he is basically, the entire PA structure right now, the Palestinian Authority structure, is just ruined by, you know, corruption, being completely co-opted by Israel, and incompetence. And on the other side, Hamas seems to be unable to do anything but figure out how to launch crude rockets and the occasional suicide bombing. What's missing is a Palestinian leadership from the grassroots that can actually negotiate as an equal with Israel. And the problem is that Israel now has the same people from the Oslo process, Netanyahu and Barak. Most of Obama's chief negotiators are from the Clinton years. So we essentially have the same cast that ruined the peace process the last time back in place, when it's going to be even harder to actually create a viable peace trying to do so. I don't see how it's going to happen.
I want to go back to something you talked about just a few minutes ago, in which you said that Israel's presence in the occupied territories cannot be dismantled. And you wrote about this in a blog. You said, quite simply, doing so would entail a far higher political, social and economic cost than with the continuation of the occupation with its manageable level of violence. So that would dismiss the idea of two states.
Well, I think in the end, two states at this point is an illusion. It doesn't have to be, because if the U.S. actually put enough pressure on Israel, and Israelis understood that they risked losing U.S. support, if they didn't get out of the territories, they would. But barring that, there's no rational reason for them to do so. And this is the problem. The Palestinians have no weapons or no ability to change this dynamic. So how can there be two states? I just don't see it happening, especially since already 20 years ago, right? Israeli scholars like Meron Ben-Venisti were writing that the territories were too integrated with Israel ever to divide them. And that was when there was maybe 1/5 the number of settlers and settlements as there are today.
Okay, we have another caller. This is Osman calling us from Georgia here in the United States. Osman, go ahead.
Yes, my question is that this peace process is going on. What major role did Russia and China have to play? Because it seems like they should have a little part to play in the other side, while in the United States we have to do a lot.
All right, thank you.
I mean, I think the role of international actors theoretically could be very important. But again, we have to remember the complete asymmetry in the balance of power between Israelis and Palestinians. And in that situation, the only people who can change the dynamics are the people who have sway over Israel. As we've seen with the world community, especially in the Security Council, the entire world can basically be against, let's say, the settlements or the Gaza war, the invasion of Lebanon. But if the United States doesn't support that, then Israel can continue doing whatever it wants. So in the end, it really is up to us. It's up to Americans to understand that we need to push Obama because it's in our national interest to actually bring peace. And if that means challenging Israel, then so be it, because peace is actually going to be better for Israelis in the long run than occupation, right? Or if it means, Israelis also becoming more engaged. But China and Russia and all these other parties, the UN, the EU, they're really not relevant at this point. It's very much down to the wire. And the only people who can make a difference are the US and the Israeli people taking control of the situation along with the Palestinian people to think of a new way for the two peoples to live together in peace and justice.
We have another email question here. This is from Sydney in Australia. It comes from S. Noma. And the question is, will Abbas, Mahmoud Abbas that is, be able to convince President Obama to accept Hamas as a political player critical for peace?
I think one of the cards that Obama is going to be prepared to play at some point is the recognition of Hamas. I'm convinced, I know for a fact, that there are already low-level talks between Hamas representatives and various U.S. officials about what would be necessary to do this, in the same way the PLO spoke to the Bush administration back in 1988 in order to make that happen. Again, Hamas is not really the issue here. The issue is the facts on the ground. It doesn't matter who's leading Palestinians or who's leading Israel or what their intentions are. What matters is there the possibility economically, territorially, and politically for a viable Palestinian state in the West Bank? If the conditions aren't created, all the good intentions and changes in position in the world by both sides won't achieve it. And if those conditions are created, whatever the true intentions of the parties are irrelevant.
Dr. Levine, we have about a minute left, and I just want to address this question. Is the 2002 Saudi initiative, which calls for recognition of Israel by Arab countries, in response, Israel would move back to the borders of 1967, is that still alive?
Well, I think it's certainly a great plan. The fact that it is barely breathing, even though it is so much in both Israel's and the United States' interest, really suggests that, at least under the Bush administration, it really wasn't in their interest to actually push for peace. So what we're going to have to see early in Obama's presidency, as Professor Telhami said, is whether the U.S. is willing to radically change our foreign policy system so that we push for peace, not just in Israel, but have a different approach in Afghanistan and Pakistan, actually push for democracy and stop supporting people like Mubarak, King Abdullah, and all the other autocrats in the region. And if we don't see that soon,
okay,
what I fear is that none of this are going to change.
I'm going to have to interrupt you there. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, and thank you for being with us. Riz is back on Monday, and we'll be looking at developments in Pakistan with Nicholas Shibly, author of To Live or To Perish. Remember, you can also follow Riz on Facebook and on Twitter at AJ Riz Khan. See you next time.